course, oh, thank you. Luckily, I know a lot of you on the call, and I'm really looking forward to digging in with you. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do together. But first, just to keep things moving, if you would mind in the chat, if you could share your name, your institutional affiliation, if you'd like, your email address for future contact and communications, only if desired. And then what brought you to our session today? It's going to be very interactive and we're going to get to have a lot of great dialogue. So what is it that brought you here today? Pop that in the chat for us. So while you're working on that, I just want to highlight a few things that we're hoping to get out of today and do with you. We, first of all, would love to highlight some of our data, which is partly why we're here. And I can talk to you about the research study, and Liz will as well. But we're going to share a little bit of our data and use it as a way to kind of engage in dialogue with you and talk about what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, and what trends and patterns we might be experiencing across different contexts, and the ways those might be different as well. We'd like to hear a little bit about what you're experiencing as a way to kind of build some momentum where we get to talk about what we want to do as a collective. We really want to think about what we can do as a community of teacher prep programs in the state of Colorado to really address some of these financial barriers in teacher ed, even if they are a little bit different across contexts. And so again, we're going to do a real brief overview of our research study and data, but really the meat and potatoes of the meeting and time together today is to really engage in some dialogue, look at some data, engage in conversation around what you're seeing of our work, what you're experiencing in your own contexts, and again, using it as a way to coalesce around some collective thinking and ways to maybe strategize in the state of Colorado to address some of these things that affect us all.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to you all for being here. It's really wonderful to be among Colorado colleagues in this work. So I'll provide just a bit of a background around kind of the literature here and why we decided to get involved in this study. This graphic comes from the More Learning, Less Debt report that Prepared to Teach put out earlier this year. And really what their work highlighted is that aspiring teachers can't work for free and learn how to teach well all at once. Some of the really important findings from this national survey is that affordability is a pervasive issue for student teachers especially. And they did include Colorado teacher candidates in this survey. They highlighted that 40% of undergrads and 76% of graduate students are working full-time during teacher preparation, and that proportion is higher for students of color. 20% of their survey respondents also have dependents. And their study highlighted that teachers incur the same amount of debt as other college students, as we know, but face lower pay. But interestingly, the burden of living costs was most significant for students and is rarely addressed through institutional financial aid. And they also found that white teacher candidates overall have greater financial resources to pay for school. So just a few more pieces of data here. Undergraduate students worry about financial situations frequently or very frequently, 76% in their study. And many of the survey respondents experienced having to choose between basic expenses and said that they were unable to handle an unexpected expense of only $250. And like I said, education students overall reported that they worried more about their daily living expenses than about the cost of tuition. And the authors kind of posit that this might be because financial aid and loans are more often directed toward tuition costs. Again, we see that these financial pressures are distributed unequally although many education students across all racial groups engage in paid work during preparation, African American and Hispanic students, which are the categories that were used in this survey by King from 2019, were less likely than their white peers to receive support from a family member. They received less support on average if they did have family support. And they were more often responsible for taking care of children. And so these have found to be barriers to students of color and students from lower income families in the teaching profession. At CU Boulder, we have a bit of quantitative data that is very much in line with these findings. So these two graphs are representing last year's incoming class of freshmen into the School of Education. You can see that the majority of our student body overall say that they do have funds to pay for college, and we can see most of them are using family financial resources and personal savings. Although there is about a third of our overall population that's worried about being able to pay for college, and many of them are relying on loans, scholarships, and paid employment. When we zoomed in on first generation students, at CU Boulder, we can see that more than half of the students in this group are concerned about paying for college. The financial pressures are much stronger here. And first generation education students was the closest that this survey had to zooming in on our students of color. And here we also see that there's really not much of a role of family financial resources in paying for college. Instead, we see grants, scholarships, and payment plans being a much larger source of funding for these students. So Ashley's going to tell you a little bit about our study.
Thanks, Liz. So I want to also give a lot of credit to Liz. So this came about because Liz and I and Mary Beth Balderas, we all care deeply about this work, and we had been invested in this work for quite some time. And Mary Beth and Liz came to me last year and said, we really want to formalize this and study this in a way that allows us to look at the data within our own institution and think about how it can inform some structural decision-making and address these barriers that we know exist. So it was really excellent timing. And so we were able to go up in front of one of our internal boards and get a small grant to fund the work last year. And so we have been doing a small scale qualitative study, exploring our own institution and our students' experiences within that. We're pairing it with, as you've seen, some of the national data as a way to start to try to triangulate what we're experiencing, the ways that they might be similar or different, and look forward to engaging shortly with you about that as well. But these are the big questions that we were exploring when we set out to engage in our own institution study. And we really wanted to understand what were the experiences that they were having, what were the barriers that they articulated, and how were those things different across the different students that we work with? And do they offer any ideas about what we can do about that, or things that they say might actually help us address those barriers?
To give you a sense of who participated in our study, the data that we're going to share with you today comes from 8 participants who joined us for focus groups or interviews. And in some cases, we've done multiple interviews with the same students kind of over time as their experiences are unfolding. So we've interviewed both undergraduate and graduate students across these 5 programs that we have listed there at the top of the slide. And in particular, we wanted to make sure that we were representing not only kind of the majority experience at our program, but also the students of color who are not the majority of students at our predominantly white institution. And so you can see the demographics of our participants there at the bottom of the slide.
Thanks, Liz. So you can see it is a smaller scale study, but it is incredibly telling. And as you'll see, it tracks with a lot of the other national data and trends that we're seeing as well. So it's really powerful to hear in their own words what they're facing and why. We found it to be really rich in terms of allowing us to really think deeply about what this might mean for our students. And we're excited to engage with you about what we're learning and have you share some insights that you might have about what's working or what you're wondering about at your institution, and draw upon some of the excerpts that we have from our student data to engage in some of this discussion. So what we've designed is 2 handouts. So thank you, Liz, for putting those together. You'll see that the handout 1, and we're going to break into small groups now, those primarily focus on our first 2 research questions. So you'll see some excerpts related to the following barriers. And what we'd like to do with that is we're going to open up a couple of groups here in a minute. And I think Sam's going to help us create some breakout rooms. And what we're going to do is take a look at the data, and in our small groups, use that to just guide some discussion. And so specifically, we'd love for you to be thinking about, what tensions exist between the financial barriers, and between that and having a robust teacher education program. And when students face these barriers, what helps or hinders them, for example. And then lastly, how can we work together around this, but also how do those local and institutional contexts shape the way in which they play out? So they might be different within our own institution, in comparison to yours. So it'd be great to have that dialogue. So what we're going to do now is hopefully Sam can help us open up some spaces to chat and look at the data and see what stands out to you. In our slides, and then we just need to pop the participant slides in here, which Liz has done, I think.
I just put a link to the first handout, but I will put a link to the slides as well.
Excellent.
Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So what we'll do is there are actually going to be some slides. So based on which group you're in, you can kind of take some notes. So if there's something like a question that comes up, something of note, and like we said, again, we're going to be sharing these out with the group at the end of the session. This is a way for us to kind of capture our thinking. What are the big things that are coming up in our small groups that we want to keep track of? So this isn't just busy work, but if there's something of note that in your group you want to talk through or kind of make note of, that we can have it in there and use that to kind of keep the conversation going.
Okay, if everybody's ready, I'm going to go ahead and send everybody to some breakout rooms here.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay.
Thanks.
Liz, are you staying out here, I assume?
Sorry, I'm going to go in. I just lost the window for a minute. Thanks.
Okay. How long did you all want to stay in here?
Thank you, Sam. I was actually just in the middle of being like, we're going to go out into the big room. And then we got Zoom lashed. So thank you. That's perfect. Liz, do you want to, should we do a quick kind of recap and then dive into the next?
That would be great. Yeah, I would love to hear what the groups talked about.
Awesome. I'm happy to recap, but is there someone in our group that feels particularly passionate about kind of sharing some things that stood out to you? All right, for the sake of time, I will share. Thank you, Ark. I think one of the big things that we were talking about is that that tension between robust teacher prep and financial barriers really resonated across different programs and different experiences. There was a mention, I think Ark mentioned this difference maybe between undergrad and graduate, maybe some of those contexts are different. However, that is a real barrier. And, something that Kimberly was talking about was just, and Sherry was, there's this ratcheting, like there's this need to obviously fill these positions. And so there's this ratcheting down of like what you need to get in, but yet at the same time, there's all these additional expectations that are being added to the role of teacher. And so even, someone like Kimberly who's saying, if I want to re-engaged in the profession in certain ways, I already know I have more I need to do. And so there's just this, they're both happening at the same time, and they're making it really complicated to be a teacher, to become a teacher, to remain a teacher. And so those were some things that we talked through, is that these questions really resonated with everyone on the call and or of interest in kind of engaging in the work further. Liz, what did you all talk about?
Yeah, I missed the beginning of the conversation, so I imagine there are some pieces I didn't hear, but we talked quite a bit about the kind of different ways that these are playing out in different contexts, right? Working with young undergraduate students or adult students, and how those, having children to feed adds different elements. Another piece that we talked about was just the kind of overwhelm, to think about those statistics of how many students worry frequently or very frequently, like how present this is for students was another piece that came up. But I imagine I missed many of the points, especially from the beginning of the conversation. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I think some of what we also talked about, just some of the bureaucratic navigating that we have to do if we want to be creative and we want to support students. We sometimes, like we talked about, just handing out a few grant dollars, you think, oh, that's not a big deal. If we would find some miraculous pot of money where we could just give them some grant dollars, sometimes you give money on one end and it really becomes a financial harm on the other end in terms of impacting financially packages and things for students. And so, really having to navigate those bureaucratic mechanisms early and wisely, and listening to those people about the options that we have to support students and where we can do so that will provide the greatest benefit to the students.
Thanks so much. I think one of the things that we've really learned in doing this research is that there isn't kind of a one-size-fits-all solution. So what we're going to get into next are some of the recommendations that students have. And there's really a wide range, kind of almost a menu of different ways that students are looking for support. And it's not always that the same solution kind of works for everyone, and even within a single program or within a single institution. But that's where we're going to kind of look next, is what does it look like to address some of these barriers from our students' perspective. And so we asked students to brainstorm what they would like to see. The first piece, of course, they talked about funding, and there are, of course, many ways that funding can look. Teacher candidates really talked about targeted supports, especially around what to them are unexpected costs of becoming a teacher, around licensure, the burden of kind of the constrained schedules. So you'll see some examples of that. You'll see some examples of how teacher candidates are asking for support with finding institutional resources and navigating those bureaucracies that we were just talking about, as places where either one of the things is, of course, we're interviewing people who are still in teacher education, and so they were able to share about the institutional resources that they were able to access that helped them to persist, as one recommendation. And then the third category were really ideas around how we can be flexible in our policies and structures to create different pathways, or different types of support for students who are starting from different places, as well as just the sort of compassion that really makes a difference for students who are facing significant stressors, to be able to kind of persist, and also to be able to reach out for help. So I'll drop into the chat our link to the second handout. And again, we're going to go into small groups, and to spend some time thinking about kind of from this list, and also from some of the different ways that you each have experienced working on this issue at your institutions, which came up in our group. What are some of the actions that we can take at our own institutions? Who else might we engage? Towards the end of our last conversation, we started talking about the financial aid office as a resource that we can engage in supporting teacher candidates, but then also thinking about what we could do as a teacher preparation community in Colorado to think about statewide supports and advocacy. So there's a link to our handout number 2. And we'll just go back to those same groups for about another 10 minutes or so, to spend some time with these suggestions and do some brainstorming. And again, feel free to use the those blank slides to record any notes. Thanks, Sam. And do you want to pull us back at about 2:50? Thanks. Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Liz, thanks, Sam.
Would love to hear from the groups again. A few things that our group talked about. One kind of piece was around just shortening the time that students are in teacher preparation and kind of getting them as quickly out into paid positions as we can. Was a strategy that has worked for a couple folks in our group. We also talked about some of the barriers that we're hitting within our institutions of higher education, kind of finding new models, ways to get to make services available for students when kind of the standard models on campus aren't working well, as well as then we talked about kind of going outside the institution and approaching district partners to find funds to pay students. And also Wendy shared about kind of some strategic partnerships where recruiting more candidates and through, I think you said like through districts that you were doing that recruitment. And when you have kind of a larger number of candidates, it brings the cost down and they're able to discount tuition for the students. So we really kind of talked about different things to do kind of in our own context, I guess.
Nice, thanks, Liz. You know, we talked about a number of things as well regarding kind of navigating the bureaucracy a little bit, talking about the role and the importance of just helping students navigate some of that work. And Kimberly had raised, you know, the idea of, you know, and others about just being really well aware of what resources actually are out there and making sure that we are able to have our candidates connected to them. And I brought up the resource of our amazing colleague, Annette, through Teach Colorado. So thinking that could be a great resource and person to talk with. And maybe that, as we move into our final part of our conversation, what do we want to do together? Thinking about the ways in which Teach Colorado could continue to support our needs and communicating with Annette around what we might need to see more of or help with as well, and get her advocacy around some of those things, but just making sure that we are able to know what our resources are so that we can help our candidates be connected to them was a big thing. And then Arik also brought up a really important point around the Praxis exams and how we know that those affect our candidates disproportionately, and the amount of retake and retest that candidates experience, specifically our candidates of color. We know they pay more, and it's harder for them to pass these exams. And so he raised the important point of wanting to advocate and work together around those issues as well. So Liz, I'm thinking, would it make sense for us to kind of bring it all together and think through where do we go next?
Yeah, I was just thinking that we have kind of one more slide, but it feels silly to put that question up and then take the conversation. So I'll just put it in the chat. This is kind of where we wanted to close our discussion around what opportunities we have to kind of work together on this issue.
Thanks, Liz. And so we know that we're kind of shorter on time, and we want to be mindful of that with you all. But, we really want to think through, we wanted to use this data in this study that we obviously care about and are drawing, from to inform our own institutional practices. But we know that we're not alone, and we know that these things resonate with you all in different ways. So we want to use this as a space to be strategic and work together around having a collective voice to address some of the big barriers that we know are affecting our institutions, our candidates all across the state. Praxis, as we know, is one of them, right? I saw a lot of nods. Paid experiences. And so with that, I do want to invite Britt in just a minute to share some thoughts on conversations that we might want to plug into. And please add to the chat too, if there are things that you find of interest that you'd like to keep talking about more as well. But something that we found in our data and that we're really pushing for is that we know that paid clinical experiences matters. And as we've talked about in our small groups and whole groups, those things are a game changer for our candidates to be able to have paid clinical experiences so that they don't have to juggle all of the other things, but actually really be immersed in that rich experience of being in the field and not having to balance it with a lot of other things that we know takes away from that experience, but they don't have a choice, right? It's not what they want, but it's what they have to do. And so Britt invited us in early September to present as part of her panel to the Colorado Commission of Higher Education. So Liz, Mary Beth, and I, and a couple of other colleagues presented kind of a more focused version of this data to really argue for paid clinical experiences and how important that would be. So I wanted to raise that could be an area that if you all find that of interest, that we could continue to work together to push and advocate for paid clinical experiences at the state level. And Britt, is there anything else you'd like to add about other conversations that might be good to know about and plug into?
No, I think that's great. Legislators are interested. The commission was certainly interested. So solutions that you have would be welcome. But I was wondering too, as Ashley was speaking, if maybe some kind of, shared fact sheet. And I don't know if that comes, from you as individuals or institutions or from code, from the directors and deans, that could, be shared with legislators around, what these common pain points are, so they can understand better that it's across institutions and, not just a expensive private one, so they could understand the situation better. Also, they are, they're looking for ways all the time. So I think legislators, if they're asking or, reaching out to you, And you can actually in advance reach out to your legislative liaisons and say that it's an issue, so that if they do get an opportunity to talk to legislators that might be interested in proposing something, they will have, you know, your specific firsthand knowledge in mind, so they can have that to share with legislators as they are, you know, considering things, and then they'll know that you have specific recommendations to offer instead of, you know, just concerns. And so I think that would be real helpful. I also wonder if, you know, maybe it's just kind of an opportunity. I mean, it's so great to hear other ideas from each other about what's working. And so I might also suggest just something, you know, quarterly, where we could kind of get together specifically around this issue again and just kind of hear about other people's ideas and solutions that are working, and other things that we can do about prior learning assessments or credit for prior learning, and, you know, how other institutions are doing that, so we can again reduce the amount of you know, get them into the classrooms quicker, you know, is what I was hearing from you. And then one more thing I want you to be able to speak to. I was wondering about, we do have these articulation agreements between the 2-year and the 4-year institutions. That's often easier for aspiring teachers to start at a cheaper 2-year institution and then matriculate into a 4-year, but the articulation agreements aren't great. It's supposed to be, you know, a full 60 credits that they can bring into your institution of higher ed, but we were really only able to agree on about 19 credits. So if I can find it quick, I'll drop that in the chat, or certainly send it to this group, you know, for your ideas and feedback. One of the, you know, tricky things is that people come into your programs at different points, right? They might not join your program until they're juniors, or they might start right away, or what are some of those early initial kind of courses that we could turn over to the 2-year institutions, that we could say these are core in every institution, so that we could get these across. That's just one more thing I was thinking of that might be helpful if we could get better at about identifying those courses.
Thanks, Britt. I appreciate that very much. So in terms of now, you know, where we go from here, that's really what our hope was, is to have this be the opening of a conversation where we get to share a little bit about what we're trying to do, the data that we have to try to back some of the changes that we're hoping to see, and would love to work alongside you into some concerted advocacy efforts with Britt and others to really try to address some of these big things that we know our candidates are experiencing. And if we're serious and we're committed to diversifying our workforce, it begins in teacher prep and making sure that the candidates we want to be out in the field teaching can persist in our programs. And we know, we have data to support that there are things that are preventing them from doing that. So we look forward to continuing the conversation. Again, we want this to be an opening for dialogue. So if you have thoughts on ways that we would like to move this forward, a specific topic in particular, or an interest in wanting to get together again, please do either put it in the chat or unmute yourself and let us know what you're thinking about in terms of a next step, what you'd be excited to do together.
All right, we are at time here, so I do want to stop for a second and just say thank you to Ashley and Liz for leading us through these conversations today. Thank you both so much for all your work and bringing this to all of us. And yeah, let's absolutely make this the beginning of a continued conversation for sure. And just a reminder that we do have about 10 more presentations this week for our convening. So if you haven't registered just yet, make sure you hit that flyer again and find what interests you and join us the rest of this week as well. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. Everybody have a great day. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you at the next one. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.